Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. We have a great show today with guest author Todd Moss, who wrote the national bestseller, The Golden Hour, which is a fast-paced novel informed by his 18 months in President George W. Bush's administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and Chief U.S. Diplomat in West Africa. Thank you, Todd, for being with us today.
Great to be with you, Lois.
As a former U.S. diplomat in West Africa, Todd Moss witnessed what really goes on behind the scenes of international diplomacy. And he has the good narrative sense to throw in rampaging Islamic radicals, a military coup in Mali, and a damsel in distress. Plus, there are the episodes of bureaucratic squabbling among the CIA, the Department of Defense, and various bureaus within the State Department. And more importantly, Todd Moss, our guest author, had great timing. He was able to get his manuscript in front of a receptive agent. Does fiction become nonfiction? Todd, what is this political situation in Mali, Africa?
It's actually a very large country in the middle of West Africa that's surrounded by a number of countries that have had security problems, countries like Libya, Algeria. And they had a coup in 2013, and at the exact same time as the coup, there were Islamists coming down from Libya. Recall that Gaddafi had died and Libya had collapsed.
Very unstable there, yeah.
Exactly. And a kind of toxic cocktail of separatists and jihadists took over an area of northern Mali the size of Texas. And it was only French forces that reinvaded Mali to recapture all of Mali. There are still French troops there. There are some UN troops. The U.S. helps assist Mali to try to keep the terror groups out and to try to keep Mali stable. Right now, there's sort of a fragile peace in the north. So it's very sensitive situation, but it's better than it was 2 years ago.
Oh, that's good. Well, let me ask you about the title of your book, The Golden Hour. What is significant about that title?
Well, The Golden Hour, when I was in college, I used to drive an ambulance in Boston.
Okay.
And we had the concept of the golden hour in emergency medicine, which is if you have a patient with multiple traumas, you have to get them in front of a doctor within an hour or their chances of survival plummet.
Okay.
So in the story, in the Golden Hour novel, it's about a professor from Amherst College who comes to the State Department, and he has a similar theory that if the U.S. doesn't respond to crises quickly, the chances of success plummet. And he presents this concept of the golden hour at the State Department, and they love it so much he's hired to try to work inside the State Department.
But it's not just 1 hour, it's 100 hours, right?
Well, in emergency medicine, it's actually about an hour. In the story, he discovers that it's about 4 days or about 100 hours after a coup. So after a coup happens in Mali, my lead character, Judd Riker, gets his chance to try to prove his theory.
So he's got 4 days, basically.
4 days.
So it's really like a great script, actually. This could be a movie.
I hope so.
Well, according to publishing experts, your book arrived at a great time because right now books set in Africa are really hot. Why is that?
Well, there aren't many international thrillers set in Africa. They're mostly, traditionally they were set in Eastern Europe or Western Europe. There have been a lot now in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, but we're starting to see more set in Africa, in large part because Africa is becoming more important to U.S. foreign policy for negative reasons like terrorism and things like Ebola, but also for positive reasons. That a lot of African economies are booming economically. We're seeing more American companies investing there.
Yes.
So there's just a tighter bond, more Americans going to countries like Nigeria or Kenya or South Africa. So that gives lead into more thrillers about Africa.
And people need to know more about Africa, really. It's been kind of in the dark in a long time. Well, I read that you left the U.S. State Department in 2008, and you are now the Chief Operating Officer and Senior Fellow at Washington, D.C.'s Center for Global Development. What do you do at that center?
So the Center for Global Development, it's a private independent research institute that conducts analysis to try to improve the way that the U.S. and other international actors help the global poor. We try to use evidence to make the decisions made in Washington, D.C. create better economic opportunities for people living in places like Asia, Latin America, in Africa. And I work in my day job, I work on African investment in energy, in business, and the relationship between Africa and the United States.
Very good. Well, our viewers should know that you worked at the World Bank and taught at the London School of Economics because you are an economist.
That's right.
And now tell our viewers, where did you grow up and where did you attend college?
Well, I grew up in Rochester, New York. I had no connection whatsoever to Africa. And then I was a college student at Tufts University in Boston. And, I was a dumb college kid. I thought it would be cool to go to Africa, something a little bit more unusual for study abroad than going to London. And I went to Zimbabwe, of all places. And I essentially got hooked on Africa from that semester. And I've been working on Africa and U.S. relationships with Africa ever since.
Well, tell us about that trip to Zimbabwe. What did you do and how did you feel about the country when you landed there?
Well, I didn't really, being a middle-class kid from upstate New York, I didn't really know anything about Africa. I didn't know what to expect. But when I got off the plane, I was actually completely shocked at how normal it seemed. It was a regular place. I lived with a lovely host family, 2 teachers, 4 children. We talked over dinner about things like sports and work and, all the usual things that families talk about at dinner. And it was really a time where I realized that Africa is not super exotic. It's just another place on Earth.
Okay.
It has some special problems.
Sure.
But it's really quite an accessible place. And I found lots of other people that get hooked on sub-Saharan Africa once they've been there once.
Yes, and of course the landscapes are gorgeous, right?
Of course.
The nature is just incredible. Well, since your initial visit more than 2 decades ago, what are the most dramatic changes in Africa currently?
Well, I think the biggest changes we've seen in sub-Saharan Africa is that a lot of countries that we think of, that many Americans still think of as poor, are actually doing really well.
Economically really doing well.
Economically really well, and in terms of politics actually
so
really well.
They have a middle class now, right? An emerging middle class.
It's small, but it's growing.
Okay.
A country like Ethiopia, people think immediately of famine. A country like Rwanda,
Sure.
people immediately think of the 1994 genocide. Actually, those 2 economies, Rwanda and Ethiopia, are among the fastest growing economies in the whole world.
Ooh.
You've got countries like Nigeria, which people still think of as only about oil or only about corruption. Actually, is one of the most dynamic economies in the world. And really, Nigeria is becoming a real cultural center for art, music, film. It's really becoming a much, much more cosmopolitan region than ever before.
Very interesting, very interesting. Well, Africa is often viewed as one of the hottest trouble spots in the world. And what is the single biggest misconception Americans have about Africa?
Well, that's a good question. I think most Americans think that Africa is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
Everywhere. There are a couple of spots. Right now, Eastern Congo is not very safe. There are parts of northern Mali that are not very safe. But I've been to 22 countries. I've never really had a major security issue.
Good.
Africa is incredibly diverse. There are places that are quiet and sleepy and lovely, and there are places that are crowded and hectic and bustling,
Yes.
and everything that you could imagine exists there. It's an incredibly diverse place.
Interesting, interesting. Now, how did you make the jump from being an economist and policy wonk during the day to writing thrillers at night?
So, I left the State Department at the end of 2008, and I went back to the think tank where I was working, the Center for Global Development, and I really started to write an outline for a nonfiction book about dysfunction inside the U.S. government.
Okay.
Why is it that everybody is so frustrated? Why is it that our government seems to react so slowly to problems? Why is it that our government always seems to be fighting with itself?
Yes.
And I decided it would be much more fun, and I wouldn't aggravate some of my former colleagues if I put it in fiction form. So I took about 3 years, and I got up early in the morning.
So did you do an outline, or did you?
Well, for the first book, I had no idea what I was doing. It was my first novel. I kind of wrote by the seat of my pants.
Okay.
But I tried to write 3 or 4 days a week early in the morning for an hour and a half. And And I really wanted to tell a story that most of all was fun. If I was getting up early to write something, it better be fun.
That's right.
I wanted to tell a story about how policy is made during a crisis. So when you read in the newspaper, there's a coup in Egypt, or war has broken out in Afghanistan, or there's a crisis in Pakistan. What's going on inside the State Department? What's going on in the Situation Room at the White House? What's going on in the basement of an embassy overseas? I wanted to take people in to hear those debates, to hear all of the infighting. And then the last thing I really wanted to do was to write a mainstream thriller for regular Americans, something that my aunt would read, but that's set in Africa in a new way.
Well, you really accomplished that with this book. I couldn't put it down. I just kept going. I've got to go find out what happens next. And well, how did you? What have you learned about writing that you didn't know before?
You know, I've written 4 nonfiction books, and when I write nonfiction, I can sit for 7, 8, 10 hours in a rush and just write. But when you're writing fiction, because it's creative, literally anything can come next.
Yes.
It's actually quite mentally exhausting. So I find that at about 2 hours, I have to take a break, and I'm usually done for the day. So I try to set my schedule so I get 90 minutes to 2 hours writing, and that's as much as I can do.
So do you do a lot of rewriting? I mean, after you write it all out, then do you start editing it and rewriting it? And
yeah, I think writing fiction is more about rewriting than just
Exactly.
Dumping it all onto a page.
Exactly. Well, now, how did you wind up working for the State Department?
You know, it was life is usually about accidents.
Yes.
So back in 2005, I was working on an analysis of debt in Nigeria.
Okay.
Nigeria owed creditors, including the U.S. government, about $36 billion.
Ooh.
And they were trying to figure out what's a good deal for everybody. How could they pay off their debt, and how could the U.S. Treasury get some of their money back, or a good deal back on their money? And I started doing some analysis on that, and through that process, got to know the U.S. Treasury negotiator who was negotiating on behalf of the U.S. government, and we hit it off. We became friends. And then he moved from Treasury to the State Department.
Okay.
And then when he got promoted from the State Department to the White House, he recommended me to fill his position at State.
Wonderful.
So it was a complete accident. And then I had one interview at State Department, and I was in. Very good, very good. I don't think it often happens that way, but it happened that way in my case.
That's right. You have magic pixie dust over you, right? Well, what would they be most surprised about the State Department's internal workings? What would most Americans think that they know but they don't know about the State Department?
Well, the State Department, I mean, relative to, say, the Pentagon, the State Department is tiny. But actually, the State Department is pretty big. Just the Africa Bureau, we have 45 embassies overseas. There's 1,500 employees just in the Africa Bureau to staff those embassies, to staff headquarters. So you actually have a lot of people involved in decision making, and that can make it very difficult to get quick decisions. That's sort of one of the premises of the golden hour, is that when you have a crisis, all of the different bureaus, there's regional bureaus for all the different regions, there's issue bureaus for democracy, for counterterrorism, for labor, all the different issues. And at a crisis moment, everyone's around a conference room, they're all fighting, and they all have different ideas about what should happen next.
And so who wins usually at a conference room? The one with the loudest voice?
Well, it's a bit of a horse trading game,
okay,
where you're kind of playing chicken with each other,
okay,
to see who can elevate. How hard do you want to fight, and are you going to elevate it to the next level up? And eventually, it could go all the way to the president if there needs to be a decision. Hopefully, something about what we should do after a coup in Mali would never get on the president's desk, but that process of negotiating is very convoluted, and it can be quite. There's a lot of back channel kind of negotiating and trickery, and that's what I tried to get at in the golden hour.
And you did it beautifully. It was wonderful. Well, as a U.S. diplomat, you were responsible for overseeing diplomatic relations in 16 African countries. What was the most difficult challenge during your tenure?
That's a great question. You know, I think what's difficult is that you're trying when you're trying to make decisions about what should the U.S. government do in a place like West Africa, where it's not on the top of anyone's priority list, but there are lots of issues that we have to deal with. There's drug trafficking, there's terrorism, there's business deals to be done, there's democracy that we would like to see flourish. We want to try to protect human rights. Lots of issues on the table. You normally, when you're sitting in Washington trying to make those decisions, you only have a fraction of the information that you need. So we have a vast intelligence network. We've got embassies in almost every country. So we've got people out there. But when you have to make a decision, especially when you have to make one quickly, you never have all the information that you need.
So there wasn't any one particular challenge. It was overall just challenging every day, right? In other words, it wasn't one that sticks out in your mind as being really difficult.
You know, when something bad happens and the U.S. wants things to move in a particular direction, in a place like West Africa, we're not going to send in the military. We're not going to have a major effort. So we have very limited tools.
Okay.
Maybe we have a little bit of money. We have diplomatic persuasion. Maybe we have some military cooperation. But when we're not going to arrive with the cavalry,
right.
You have to be very kind of clever and careful with the tools that you use. And that really means building relationships with local governments.
And negotiating.
Absolutely.
Negotiating well. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, why did you choose fiction rather than nonfiction for sharing your State Department experiences?
Yeah, I thought, you know, most of all, I read fiction when I'm on the beach or in an airplane, and I thought it would be fun to try to write fiction, especially an international thriller.
Yeah.
So the biggest reason is it's just much more fun.
Yeah, yeah.
But I also thought that in some ways you can tell stories in a fiction format that you couldn't tell in a nonfiction format. In particular, you know, I did not have to worry about revealing classified information.
And that's big, yeah.
And because a lot of the characters in the book are drawn from real people, nobody is exactly an actual person. So I didn't have to worry about creating animosity among people.
After writing your first draft of The Golden Hour, your book, which is about a fictional coup in Mali, a real-life coup overthrew the nation's government. I mean, did you have any idea that was going to happen?
You know, I wish I could say I had a crystal ball and I predicted it. I really didn't expect it in Mali, a coup. They'd had a history of coups, but I had actually written the book based in large part on a real coup in 2008 in another country, neighboring country called Mauritania.
Okay.
But nobody has ever heard of Mauritania, the capital Nouakchott. No one's heard of Nouakchott. But I did think that Mali is a beautiful country, and it has a city in the north called Timbuktu, where a lot of the action in the story takes place, and everybody's heard of Timbuktu.
I love that, Timbuktu. And I'd love for you to describe to our viewers the Sahara Desert and Timbuktu. What does it look like? How did you feel when you first saw it?
Well, I also didn't, you know, I'd heard of it as a sort of mythical city.
Yes.
You know, it's a centuries-old city in the Sahara Desert that was a crossroads for trade coming from the north to the south, a crossroads of people, of cultures, religions, and of scholarship. So it's really a quite vibrant place.
But it's kind of sand-colored, right?
Well, it's in the desert, and the desert has been growing, so parts of the city have kind of been taken over by the sand. So the roads, many of the roads are covered in sand. The homes are made of mud, and a lot of the homes are made of mud and sand, so they're sort of sand-colored. So it kind of has this pall to, this sort of pall to it. But it's a beautiful, beautiful, welcoming city, and despite the recent trouble they've had with some of the jihadist groups, it's actually a wonderful, wonderful place.
I'd love to visit. What did your former colleagues at the State Department say about your novel's revelations?
So most of them, were really happy that someone wrote an international thriller about diplomats. I think the CIA and the Pentagon gets all the glory.
They do. A lot of the action's there. Yeah, that's right.
So they were happy that somebody wrote about diplomacy and what the civilian diplomats do. And a lot of them, feel the frustration that the characters in the book also feel. They live with that tension. And I gave a book talk for a group of State Department employees, and it was part book talk, part therapy session, where people wanted to get off their chest, their war stories about infighting and what wasn't working.
Yes, yes. And were you surprised by the positive success of the Golden Hour?
Well, this one being my first novel, I had no idea what to expect. So of course I'm thrilled when people like it.
You've gotten wonderful reviews. I mean, it's just glowing from top-notch writers. And
yeah, well, that's a pleasant surprise. You never know. I'm very thick-skinned about my nonfiction writing. You write fiction, you're putting yourself out there in a different way, and you really don't know what to expect. And some people really get what you're trying to do and they love it. Some people won't. You can't make everybody happy, of course. But what I found really exciting is that the publisher loved it so much they've actually asked for a 4-book series.
Wonderful.
So the Golden Hour is just the first in a 4-book series that will follow the main characters through.
Yeah, and you've also created some powerful, smart women in your book. I mean, are women well represented today in actual diplomatic circles?
Oh, absolutely. In the book, the Secretary of State is a woman, and I actually didn't even consciously make the decision, I need to make her a woman. I'd worked for Condoleezza Rice. We've now had Hillary Clinton. We had Madeleine Albright. It almost seemed natural that the Secretary of State is often a woman.
Yes.
And then throughout the Foreign Service, there are lots of strong women in all sorts of positions. It's just not something that I had done deliberately, but it just came out naturally through the story.
Well, it was wonderful because the woman was the ambassador in your story, so it was wonderful.
That's right, and in that story, that she was actually inspired by a real ambassador in a neighboring country.
Now, given that the action is set in Mali, what are the African countries that border Mali? What are the countries, so we can get an understanding of exactly where Mali is?
Right. So Mali's like right in the heart of West Africa. So you have Algeria and Libya to the north. To the south, you have a little country, Burkina Faso. You've got Senegal to the west, Mauritania to the west. So it touches on lots of countries. And we look at a map and there are lines and they look very clean and straight. Well, out in the desert or out in the middle of nowhere, those lines are almost meaningless.
Okay.
So people come and go over the borders, which is good for trade, it's good for the flow of people and ideas, but it also makes the U.S. government crazy because we want governments to control their borders.
Sure.
But if you think about the entire northern zone of Mali, again, the size of Texas, the Malians might have 3,000 troops in that entire area. And it's virtually impossible to police.
Wow. And what's the population of Mali?
It's a good question. I think it's around 14, 15 million.
Okay.
It's mostly concentrated in the south where it's cooler, there's more water. The desert's not a very hospitable place to live, so there's not very many people in the middle of the Sahara.
Well, and the other thing I enjoyed in reading your description of the fictional Senator McCall and his office on Capitol Hill. Can you describe for our viewers a typical Senate office with lots of diplomats in the hallways and lobbyists, I would say?
Right. So I tried to have the action. It's jumping between Africa and Washington, D.C. And in Washington, got the CIA, state, White House. And then Capitol Hill plays a big role. So there's Senator McCall is the Senate Foreign Relations Chair. Which is a kind of kingmaker for foreign policy on Capitol Hill.
And I loved your dialogue. You captured it. It was so realistic.
I'm glad to hear you say that. Dialogue can be a little hard to write, so I actually say it out loud, and that helps you think, wait, is that what something somebody would really say? It
sounded very. I thought you must be taping this. You must be.
I didn't, but very often you'll go to a senator's office, and there's a little lobby, and there's all kinds of people waiting for their appointment. So I thought that was a nice scene to have where people are trying to get Senator McCall to do certain things.
And also, I read that I read The Secret of Getting Ahead in the Army wasn't winning battles or doing your job well. Instead, it was doing everything you could do to make your immediate superior look good. Is that true in the State Department? Are people trying to make their immediate superior look good, or is that?
Well, I think my experience certainly was when you have a team and everyone has great respect for the leader of who you're working with, you can get fantastic things done. and really trying to find somebody that you want to dedicate long hours, stay away from your family, fly around the world. You really want to make sure, the best scenario is working for somebody who you have tremendous respect for and you want to help them succeed. That was the case for me. I worked for Assistant Secretary Jendai Frazier, one of my heroes, absolutely wonderful. And that was a very great inspiration to do everything that we could to try to help her succeed and to help the U.S. push a policy that was going to be the best for the United States.
And so in writing this book, did you buy a lot of novels, and did you like political novels, and start reading madly to get ready to write your own, or do you have favorite authors that you read? And
yeah, I didn't really do any homework like that. I had read a lot of novels just casually for fun. I think the writer that inspired me most for this was David Ignatius, who's also a Washington Post columnist.
Great writer.
And what I loved about David's books are that they're very fast-paced, but they're also realistic. I recognized a lot of things in his books that struck me as true, and they were also complicated in a way that I thought was reflective of sometimes how difficult these issues can really be. It's not just a simple, bust in there with guns and rescue the day. You really got to try to figure out what are all the players up to, and who's working with me and who's working against me. That's the key puzzle you want to solve.
Now, Todd, where can our viewers find your book in Arlington?
So it's available on Amazon, at Barnes & Noble. You can get it at independent bookstores, or on my website is toddmossbooks.com.
Okay, and your next novel will be coming out, this summer, later this summer?
So the second book in the series is called Minute Zero. That actually came out last September.
Okay.
And the main character is fighting a bad election in southern Africa. And the third book in the series is called Ghosts of Havana, and that will be out this fall. And it's about, as you could guess, political intrigue in Cuba.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, so great you joined us today. Thank you so much for being on the Bookman's Corner.
Thank you for having me, Lois.
Wonderful, wonderful discussion. And please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. Thanks for watching.